So my name is Jonathan Coad. I've been a frontline media lawyer for about 30 years. Unusually, for all those 30 years, I've both been a claimant and a defendant lawyer. So I've sought to protect reputation and privacy, but I've also legaled out films, television programs, books, theatre shows, some impressive names, like I legaled out the autobiography of Basil Brush, just to drop a big name in there. I am also, as well as being passionate to protect the rights, human rights of individuals, equally passionate about the importance for there to be a freedom for the British media to say what they need to say about public interest issues. The problem here is that there is an imbalance, I think, and the freedom, particularly of the press, which is regulated differently from the broadcast media, to mislead us without really any sanctional control, is a problem which I've observed for all my 30 years and about which I've written. And that's the reason why I'm making a presentation to Parliament. So we're in a very fascinating situation here, because of the big Fleet Street publishers, Reach, who published the Mirror titles, News, who published the News of the World, as then was, now the Sun on Sunday, have both been caught with their fingers, so to speak, in the cookie jar, phone hacking and the like. The one big publisher that was not caught was Associated Newspapers. And of course, there are two possibilities. Either they never did it, or they never got caught. So on the 6th of October, a seismic claim was begun suggesting that Associated Newspapers' titles, the Mail and Sunday, had indeed hacked phones and engaged in illegal information gathering and surveillance. Now that's extraordinary in itself, but what is even more extraordinary is that one of the claimants is Baroness Lawrence. And Baroness Lawrence, for anyone who doesn't know, was the mother of a young man who was murdered at a bus stop about 20 odd years ago. And the police made a complete mess of the investigation, the suggestions that there was a racist attitude and sense of not properly pursuing it. And then some years later, to its great credit, the Daily Mail published on its front pages, these are the people that murdered Lawrence. Well, I remember that very well, because I was invited on to 5 News live to be asked questions by Charlie State about what the legal ramifications were of that, which was fairly scary. Now, because of that, Doreen Lawrence, Baroness Lawrence, as I should properly call her, a heroic lady, became an ally of Associated Newspapers and, as I understand it, to some extent, Paul Dacre, who effectively still runs Associated Newspapers, at least that's the impression we have. So for her to decide to bring such a claim against Associated Newspapers titles is massive. Now, we have no idea yet as to what evidence there is to support it. Just to explain technically what's happened is that the claim forms have been issued, and those are just short documents, essentially a ticket into the court system, which set out very briefly what the claim is. What then happens is that Doreen Lawrence and Prince Harry, not small people bringing this claim, then have to serve what we call particulars of claim, and that's a full document setting out all the claims that are being made. And at that point, Associated Newspapers must serve a defence, and at the point where the proceedings are acknowledged, then we get to see the particulars of claim, so we'll see in detail what the claim is. Now, as I say, we have no idea yet whether those claims are well founded. However, I think we can assume that Baroness Lawrence would not have started that claim unless she had seen credible evidence to justify it. The allegations are still fairly brief in their terms, but they allege the illegal accessing of telephone calls, illegal surveillance, and essentially blagging out information from source of information like hospitals and so on and so forth, in order to get copy for the publishers to run. Now, those are monumentally criminal acts. People went to jail for that. So potentially it's immense because, first of all, there is the possibility that senior people at Associated Newspapers may end up in jail, like Andy Coulson did, who was the editor of the News of the World. Secondly, there is the possibility of this being the beginning of a much greater investigation into what they've done, and more information may arise, and more people may come forward to bring claims. Because, as I understand it, there's an ongoing investigation. So the third thing is that the Leveson inquiry heard from Paul Dacre. I'm pretty sure it also heard from Elizabeth Hartley, who's the most senior lawyer there, and other very senior people, Associated Newspapers, all of whom flatly denied that any such activity had been undertaken at Associated Newspapers. So if it turns out that those claims were untrue, then that has potentially serious ramifications from the people that gave that evidence in the Leveson inquiry. I have fought Associated Newspapers one way or another in the courts for about 30 years. Each of newspaper groups have their own slightly different character. Of all the newspaper groups that I have fought, the nastiest opponent is Associated Newspapers. And their conduct has included a threat personally against me to try and obtain a costs order against me, a 6-figure costs order against me, claiming that I was guilty of misconduct during one of the claims. I'm happy to say the judge threw it out at the first hearing. But I can remember walking around my house. I didn't want to tell my wife, thinking I could lose the house and I'd get struck off as well. So if you're up against Associated Newspapers, it's studs up litigation. But more importantly, if you're fighting a newspaper, then you're the protection between the newspaper and your client. Now, I have seen the cruelest behaviour towards particularly women clients of all the Fleet Street titles on the part of Associated Newspapers. And I'm going to give you one example in the book, and I'm going to call from the book, I'm going to call the lady Grace. It's not her real name. Grace was a successful actress. She was popular in BBC sitcoms. She wasn't a big star, but she was, a very respectable working actress. She was horribly stalked. I mean, really, really badly stalked for a period by someone who she'd met at a gym. She'd worked out that he was a nutcase fairly quickly, and he used to slash the seats in her car, used to send her razor blades. She smashed down the door to the block of flats where she lived, and one time he attacked her outside a restaurant, punched her unconscious, and was caught putting her unconscious body in the back of his car by passers-by. That's what she went through. Now, for reasons I hadn't got time to explain, she came to the attention of the Mail. It was about a related story. And she was approached by a male journalist who's still working and is now fairly senior. And the editor there is also still working and very senior, though at another paper. And she, Grace, was given the impression that she was being dated, wooed, whatever. So down went her guard, and he got out of her this story on the assurance that it would go no further. So one late December evening, a few years ago, I received an absolutely desperate, hysterical call from this lady Grace, because this man had threatened to kill her, trying to kill her, and threatened to kill her parents, elderly parents, saying she just had a call from this journalist saying that it was going to go in the newspaper. And she was petrified. I've never seen anyone so frightened, even on film, as she was, because We lived fairly close to each other. I told her where my flat was. We both lived in Docklands. And she sat in the middle of my living room, literally shaking with fright, like a cartoon character. She was that frightened. So she explained all this to me, and I said, look, I know the senior lawyer over at Associated Newspapers. I will ring him in the morning. I'll explain the situation to him. I will ask him not to treat this as a legal issue just because of a passion issue, and that you're not Madonna, Liz Hurley, or whatever. It should be a story they'd be prepared to drop. So I calmed her down, gave her a lot of cocoa, and sent her home. Next morning, I ran the paper, couldn't get through to the senior lawyer, ended up speaking to a lady lawyer. I was completely unable to persuade her that anything should be done about this. So I asked to speak to the managing editor, and by that time, it was a couple of days later, I was going up a brick wall. I was a firm for shillings in those days, and Grace, my client, was too frightened to sleep at home, so she was sleeping with her parents because the store knew where she lived. And during the day, she was in the offices. I used to go get her. She was in reception, and I go and buy her sandwiches for lunch, so she was never at home. So the managing editor agreed to speak to me on the phone. Now, I would never let a client speak to a managing editor normally, but the situation was so desperate, I thought, well, he might, if he hears it from here, her. So I put her on speakerphone. I gave her some do's and don'ts, and I let her explain what had happened to her, that he had threatened to kill her, threatened to kill her parents, and she was, with good reason, sure that if the story was published, he'd come around and kill her. Do you know what he said? I should have added that she was so frightened of him that she fled to India for some months to some kind of retreat centre. He knew that. She explained that she'd had to flee the country, and his suggestion was that she then flees the country and they then publish the story. I said, well, hang on a sec. I said, first of all, what about her parents? Secondly, when does she come back? And thirdly, how does she make a living? Didn't seem to occur to him, any of that. Anyway, so I still couldn't get any undertaking out of them. And there came a point on the day before Christmas Eve where I rang them up and said, look, either I get an injunction before Christmas, or I'm going to have an undertaking that you will not publish the story until the new year. Surely you'll give me that. No. So I then had to go down and get an injunction, which I did. They wrote me a revolting letter, a horrible letter, saying, we want you to show this to the judge. And the judge took one look at it and said, where's the pen? Where do I sign? It was so ugly. And I then had a total of about 18 months of absolutely studs up litigation with these people. One Friday, they sent me 6 letters in the afternoon. The way they conducted that litigation was the worst I've ever seen, and I've seen some really rough litigation. Eventually, they agreed not to publish it. They never formally undertook to publish it, but they said so in open correspondence, and I had to leave it at that. I wanted to get her compensation because she had suffered a complete physical and nervous breakdown as a result of this. They wouldn't pay her any compensation, and there came a point, I'm trying to keep the story short, believe it or not, where I could take it no further. But these people knew, they saw a medical report for this woman. I had to get a medical report to bring the claim. So they read this horrendous medical report. Did that cause them to pause or stop? No, it didn't. The cruelty they showed towards this woman was unspeakable. And as I say, I tell the full story in my book. It's not the only story I could tell, it's just the most vivid. So why is this all important? Why have I told these stories about just experiences in my practice in dealing with some of these newspaper groups? And the only story I've told is Associated Newspapers. I fought the Mirror and the Sun titles and could tell some fairly grim stories about those as well. So the reason it's important is that these publishers, Reach, Associated Newspapers, and News, wield immense power over us with massive power via their website, the social media, Instagram, Twitter. I mean, every imaginable form of communication, they pour out material to us. They have an almost limitless ability to mislead us about the environment, politics, consumer issues, you name it, anything that's important to us. Also about the character of important people in our lives. You know, character of politicians, teachers, clergymen, public figures who, if their reputation is wrongly trashed and they're effectively therefore cancelled, that's a loss to all of us. We all are losers if we read and believe things which aren't true. So, why am I so exercised about this? Well, at the end of the Levis inquiry, the only thing that mattered was what was going to replace the Press Complaints Commission. And Lord Leveson made some very sensible and moderate proposals for what we call a Leveson-compliant regulator. He had amongst his advisors a number of media people. So this just wasn't judicial making it up as he goes along. Every single Fleet Street title flatly refused to agree to a Leveson-compliant regulator. The Guardian, the Financial Times, and the Independent have to have a sort of vague internal system which doesn't create any confidence at all. All the rest of the Fleet Street titles are under what's called the Independent Press Standards Organisation. Now, the history of that is not pretty. So it was installed, funnily enough, in the same offices as the Press Complaints Commission. All they did is they changed the brass plate outside. The staff, strangely enough, were Press Complaints Commission staff. They started with the Press Complaints Commission Code. Essentially, it's a rebadged Press Complaints Commission. The Press Complaints Commission itself was the third unsuccessful form of self-regulation. Now, Fleet Street has bullied our politicians away from forcing them in to a regulatory scheme which properly holds them to account. Now, that is serious for us all. And even though I'm kind of a voice crying in the wilderness, whenever I get the opportunity, I want to speak out that really does need to change. We all need the protection of an effective regulator for the newspapers.